Could you give us a definition of pop-up book?
Yes, a pop-up book is a three-dimensional book that has movable parts. It has pull tabs and lift-ups and wheels. And the thing about a pop-up book is that you open it and it becomes three-dimensional, and when you close it, it folds down. And pop-up books all have one thing in common, and that is that they are all manufactured by hand. So nothing can be assembled by machine. That's what makes a pop-up book.
Why do you like making pop-up books?
What I like about pop-up books as an artist is the interactivity, the fact that the reader must touch the pop-up book, pull the tabs, and that's what I think draws people into pop-up books.
Do you think any book could be a pop-up?
No, in fact, I know for certain that not every book makes a good pop-up book. I've been asked by publishers to make a book to consider an M.C. Escher book, and when I looked at the book, I realized that M.C. Escher, his artwork really was about two-dimensional artwork, and if you made it three-dimensional, it would ruin what M.C. Escher had intended. So, so I like to look at books carefully and make the decision. Sometimes, yes, they're good as a pop-up book. Sometimes they're not good as a pop-up book.
Can you give us a brief history of pop-up books, and do any of these books still exist?
Sure. Well, it's believed that the very first pop-up books, and they weren't necessarily pop-up books, they were books with movable parts, and so we'll start with movable books, were created maybe in the early 1300s. There's evidence that there was a book in the 1400s that was an astrological book that had a movable wheel, and I've actually seen that book. It was at the University of Arizona. So there are samples that do exist. Then the next pop-up books that you would see would be in the late 1800s in Germany by a man named Lothar Meggendorfer and the Nisters. Then pop-up books moved to England, and you saw quite a few books in the early 1900s from a company called Bucano, and then there were some books published in Czechoslovakia and books published in the United States in the 30s. The Blue Ribbon books, which is where the term pop-up came from, that was the company that coined the term pop-up. Later, in the 60s, along came a company called Individual Communications. They're based here in the United States, and that's the company that is responsible for the current renaissance of pop-ups that we see right now.
What countries first made pop-ups?
Well, if you're considering pop-ups as the Meggendorfer pop-ups, which is what the standard is, it looks like Germany and England were the first countries that made pop-ups because they were manufactured in Germany but also sold and published in England.
Today, where are most pop-up books developed and why?
Well, the majority of pop-up books are now developed here in the United States. It has a lot to do with the fact that Intervisual Communications was based here, and many of the people who were at that company are now still in the business. And it also has to do with the fact that the majority of the big publishers in the U.S. are the companies that initiate the projects. There are quite a few books coming out of England as well, and those are the two main countries that generate the beginning of the pop-up.
Where are pop-up books manufactured?
Most pop-up books now are manufactured in China and in Thailand, although when I first started in the business, the majority of books were manufactured in Colombia, South America. But it has all moved to the Orient now, all the manufacturing.
Do you think pop-up books are experiencing a moment of success?
Yes, well, I think for the past 20 years, pop-up books have become quite popular, and hopefully it will stay that way for quite a while.
Do you think pop-up books will remain popular?
I hope so. I think there are three key ingredients in the success of pop-ups. One is that publishers and authors and illustrators are creating good books. The second aspect is that it requires the manufacturing of the pop-up book, which is a very sort of complicated process. And the third is that it requires that the general public or the consumer still enjoys pop-ups. So as long as those three elements are still available, I think we'll have pop-up books.
How did you learn the art of pop-up bookmaking?
Well, I started off as an illustrator. I studied art in college in Utah, and I moved to Los Angeles at one point, where I went to work for this company, Intervisual Communications. And it was at Intervisual that I spent 7 years studying and learning the art of paper engineering and pop-up. And I learned to make pop-ups from other paper engineers who were working there at the time.
Do art schools in America teach the art of pop-ups?
I don't know of any art colleges in the United States that actually teach courses of pop-up bookmaking. There probably are courses where they're teaching three-dimensional art and include paper engineering and pop-up as part of the curriculum, but I don't know of any one particular course that teaches the art of paper engineering.
Is it necessary to know engineering to be a pop-up artist, or can someone trained as a designer or an illustrator learn the art of pop-up?
Well, most paper engineers, pop-up artists that I know that are working today probably started as illustrators and designers. So I don't think it's necessary to know engineering, although some engineering wouldn't hurt. The one thing I do know is that if you are an author or an illustrator or an artist and you enjoy also building and working with three-dimensional designs, then this might be something that you could be interested in.
How are your books created? Do you write the story first?
Quite often, I begin with the concept of the book. Once I have the concept, I then try to design the paper engineering, the illustration, and the words to work together to define that concept. Although in my Red Dot series, I did something a little bit different there. I started with the structures first. I just built free-form, modern art sculptures, and once those are finished, I then wrote about them and added a concept to the project.
Are there many paper engineers working in the world today?
Well, there was a time when we used to say that there were 12 paper engineers working in the world. Now I think that's probably expanded to 30 or 40. But the fact is there are not very many paper engineers. There simply isn't the work for many engineers, but there are new paper engineers coming about every day. So who knows what the future will bring.
Can you name some of the other paper engineers working today?
Sure. Some of the paper engineers working in the United States would include Robert Sabuda, Matthew Reinhardt, Jim Diaz, Tor Lockvig, Bruce Foster. A couple of the British paper engineers would include David Pelham, Ron Vandermeer, Graham Brown. There's a very good paper engineer out of Holland named Kees Morbek, and a new paper engineer, relatively new paper engineer out of Bulgaria named Anton Rudevsky, who was a architect to begin with, and then a brand new paper engineer out of France named Mariam Batali, who's done a beautiful ABC book.
In some of your books, you use materials other than paper. What do you consider when adding these materials?
Well, some of the considerations in adding other materials are, to begin with, safety. So the first thing I think about is could the item that I'm adding to the book harm a child? And if so, of course, that wouldn't go into the book. The materials also need to be able to be attached to the book somehow, so they have to be glued to the book. So usually if it's something that can be glued to paper, then we can use it. And the third aspect is cost, the price of adding these other materials. So those are the three main elements. But I love adding various materials, and I'm always looking for something new to add to my books.
In making your pop-ups, are there basic structures that are always used, or can you use any kind of mechanism?
Well, a few years ago, a co-author and I wrote a book called The Elements of Pop-Up. And in the Elements of Pop-Up, we defined 44 specific structures that paper engineers use to make pop-ups, the basic palette of pop-up, if you will. So there are those 44 basic structures, and paper engineers use those 44 basic structures in combination to make large, complex pop-ups. This is an example of that book. And you'll see that these are simple forms, but when combined, become complicated, pop-up structures. And one of the things that we're always trying to do as paper engineers is to find something new and something different. So you're really only bound by your own imagination in what can be used in the pop-up itself. And also, it's a structure that needs to be manufactured by hand. So Those are the sort of things we consider when using our pop-up structures.